Good afternoon. My colleagues and I remain squarely focused on achieving our dual mandate goals of maximum employment and stable prices for the benefit of the American people. While the unemployment rate remains low, it has edged up. Job gains have
Chào tất
slowed,
cả các anh chị
downside
đã
risks
quay
to
trở lại
employment
với
have risen.
livestream
At the
họp
same
báo
time, inflation has risen recently and remains somewhat elevated.
sau cuộc họp FOMC tháng 9.
In support of our goals and in light of the shift in the balance of risks, today the Federal Open Market Committee decided to lower our policy interest rate by a quarter percentage point. We also decided to continue to reduce our securities holdings.
Hiện tại thì bây giờ đang là
More
cái
to say about
lời
monetary
giới thiệu
policy
mở
after
đầu
briefly
cho
reviewing economic developments.
cuộc họp báo. Thì
Recent
Chủ tịch
indicators
Powell
suggest
đang
that growth
nói
in
lại về
economic
tình hình
activity has
của
moderated.
đất nước cũng như là
GDP growth,
tình hình của
GDP rose at a pace
các
of
cái
about
chỉ số
1.5%
chỉ báo
for the
về
first half of the year,
dữ liệu kinh tế Mỹ.
down from 2.5% last year. The moderation in growth largely reflects a slowdown in consumer spending. In contrast, business
Tiêu
investment
dùng đang
and
có
output
dấu
measured
hiệu
in tangibles has
suy giảm
picked up from last year's pace. Activity in the housing
so
sector
với năm
remains
ngoái.
weak. In our summary of economic projections, the median participant projects
Trong dự báo
GDP
kinh tế
to
của chúng
rise
tôi
1.6% this year and 1.8% next year, a touch
thì
stronger than projected.
GDP thực sẽ tăng trưởng
In the
1,6% đến cuối năm nay và
rate
1,8%
edged
đến
up
năm
to
sau.
4.3% in August, but remains little changed over the past year at a relatively low level. Payroll job gains have slowed significantly to a pace of just
Ông nói đến
29,000
thị
per
trường lao động,
month over the
thì
past
thất
3
nghiệp
months.
giữ ở mức 4,3%.
A good part of this slowing likely reflects a decline in the growth of the labor force due to lower immigration and lower labor force participation. Even so, labor
Cái
demand
việc
has
mà
softened, and the recent
cái
pace
số
of
lượng việc
job
làm mới của Mỹ
creation
nó giảm
appears
bởi
to
vì
be
là
well
cái lượng
below
nhập
the
cư của Mỹ
break-even
giảm đáng
rate
kể nên là cái
needed to
thành phần
hold
tham
the
gia vào thị
unemployment
trường lao
rate
động giảm.
constant. In addition, wage growth has continued to moderate while still outpacing inflation. Overall, the market slowing in both the supply of and demand for workers is unusual. In this less dynamic and somewhat softer labor market, the downside risks to employment appear to have risen. In our SEP, the median projection for the unemployment rate is 4.5% at the end of this year and edges down thereafter. Inflation has
Tỷ
eased
lệ
significantly
thất
from
nghiệp
its highs in
cuối năm nay đang dự báo ở
2022,
mức
but
4,5%,
remains somewhat elevated
là một
relative
cái
to
ngưỡng
our
cao
2%
kỷ lục và
year one goal.
sẽ giải quyết được bài toán tỷ lệ
Estimates
thất
of the
nghiệp cho đến năm
based
sau.
on the Consumer Price Index and other data indicate that total PCE prices rose 2.7% over the 12 months ending in August, and that,
Bây giờ
excluding
ông đang nói
all
chuyển
food
sang
and
các
energy
dữ liệu lạm phát.
categories, core
PCE
PCE
tăng trưởng
prices rose
2,7%
2.9%.
hàng năm.
These readings are higher than earlier in the year as inflation for goods has picked up. In contrast, disinflation appears to be continuing for services. Near-term measures of inflation expectations have moved up, on balance, over the course of this year on news about tariffs, as reflected in both market and survey-based measures. Beyond the next year or so, however, most measures of longer-term expectations remain consistent with our 2% inflation goal. The median projection in the SEP for total PCE inflation is 3.0% this year and falls to 2.6% in 2026 and to 2.1% in 2027. Our monetary policy actions are guided by our dual mandate to promote maximum employment and stable prices for the American people. At today's meeting, the committee decided to lower the target range for the federal funds rate by a quarter percentage point to 4 to 4.25%, and to continue reducing the size of our balance sheet. Changes to government policies continue to evolve, and their effects on the economy remain uncertain. Higher tariffs have begun to push up prices in some categories of goods, but their overall effects on economic activity and inflation remain to be seen. A reasonable base case is that the effects on inflation will be relatively short-lived, a one-time shift in the price level. But it is also possible that the inflationary effects could instead be more persistent, and that is a risk to be assessed and managed.
Ông đang nói về
To
cái
ensure
việc
a
là
one-time increase in the
tác
price
động
level
lạm phát từ
does
chính
not
sách thuế quan của
become
Tổng
an
thống Trump,
ongoing inflation problem.
các cái trường hợp có thể diễn ra
In the near
và
term,
cái
risks
rủi
of
ro phải gặp
inflation
phải.
are tilted to the upside and risks to employment to the downside. At challenging situation. When our goals
Đoạn
of
này thì anh chị
inflation
thực ra chưa có quan trọng bởi vì đây là ông
calls for us to
đang
balance
đọc
both
một cái văn
sides of
bản
the
đã
demand
chọn
and
sẵn
supply.
công bố
With
trên trang
downside
web
risks
của
of employment
của
having
Fed.
increased, the balance of risks has shifted. Accordingly, we judged it appropriate at this meeting to take another step toward a more neutral policy stance. With today's decision, we remain well positioned to respond in a timely way to potential economic developments. We will continue to determine the appropriate stance of monetary policy based on the incoming data, the evolving outlook, and the balance of risks. In our SEP, FOMC participants
Đây,
found their
tức là
individual
cái
assessments
biểu đồ dot plot đây
path for the federal funds rate.
là cái kỳ vọng
Based on
của
what each
các quan chức
participant
Fed
tried to
về lãi suất
use in every
của
scenario
Fed
for the
trong
economy.
ngắn và dài hạn.
The
Thì
median
có một cái sự
participant
thay đổi
believes
là
the appropriate
đến tháng 9 này thì chúng ta thấy là cái kỳ vọng của lãi suất của Fed đến cuối năm nó giảm được đến mức 3,6% so với cái dot plot của tháng 6 là ở mức 3,9%, tức là thêm 30 điểm cơ bản nữa. Thế thì người ta sẽ kỳ vọng là Fed có thể sẽ cắt giảm thêm 2 lần đến hết năm nay, tháng 11 và tháng 12.
Policy is not on a preset course. The Fed has been assigned two goals for monetary policy: maximum employment and stable prices. We remain committed to supporting maximum employment, bringing inflation sustainably to our 2% goal, and keeping longer-term inflation expectations well anchored. Our success in delivering on these goals matters to all Americans. We understand that our actions affect communities, families, and businesses across the country. Everything we do is in service to our public mission, and we at the Fed will do everything we can to achieve our maximum employment and price stability goals. Thank you. I look forward to our discussion.
Bây giờ mình đến cái phiên thứ hai, phiên phỏng vấn.
Thank you. Chris Rugaber, Associated Press. As you know, Fed Governor Stephen Byron has continued, kept his position at the White House, even as he's joined the Fed board. This is the first time, I believe, the Fed's board has had someone with executive branch ties in decades. Does this compromise the Fed's independence from day-to-day politics? And relatedly, how can you...
Vâng, câu hỏi đầu tiên là về ông Fed luôn. Tức là ông trở thành một thành viên thống đốc của Fed, tuy nhiên là vẫn giữ cái vị trí ở Nhà Trắng. Thế thì liệu điều này là có phải là cái làm mất cái sự độc lập của Fed không? Thì ông trả lời được không? Cái này nó không ảnh hưởng.
Tariffs may be impacting the labor market and other parts of the economy instead. Do you see that as a possible outcome here, that tariffs are the reason we're seeing some slowing, particularly in the labor market, rather than in inflation?
It's certainly possible.
Ông hỏi là liệu chính sách thuế quan có phải là một cái nguồn cơn tác động lên thị trường lao động ngoài cái vấn đề liên quan đến lạm phát không? Có cái việc mà thuế quan ấy, nó ảnh hưởng lên lạm phát, mà lạm phát thì sẽ ảnh hưởng lên tỷ lệ thất nghiệp. Vì vậy là cái yếu tố thuế quan đương nhiên là một yếu tố có tác động lên thị trường lao động.
Same time, demand for workers has also come down quite sharply, and to the point where we see what I would call a curious balance. Typically when we say things are in balance, that sounds good, but in this case, the balance is because both supply and demand have come down quite sharply. Now demand coming down a little more sharply because we now see the unemployment rate edging up.
Economic conditions and the balance of risks no longer warrant a restrictive policy setting?
So I don't think we can say that. But what we can say is this: that over the course of this year, we kept our policy at a...
3 lần thì vàng tăng mạnh không hẳn đâu chị ạ. Vàng đã tăng mạnh với kỳ vọng liên quan đến suy thoái kinh tế của Mỹ từ giai đoạn trước rồi. Đoạn này thì nó sẽ phải chịu cái áp lực sốt lời của thị trường. nên là chúng ta vẫn
I
phải
think
chờ đợi xem là
just
vàng
go
sẽ phản
back
ứng
to
như nào.
April,
Cái nên
that
em nghĩ là
revised job
nó
creation
sẽ điều chỉnh
number
nhiều hơn
back
và
in
nó sẽ tăng.
in August. It can kind of I can no longer say that. And so what that means is that the risks were clearly tilted toward inflation. I would say they're moving toward equality. Maybe they're not quite at equality. We don't need to know that. But we do know that they've moved meaningfully toward greater equality in risks between the two goals, and that suggests that we should be moving in the direction of that. And that's what we did today.
What circumstances would a larger than 25 basis points rate cut be warranted, and how seriously was that option entertained at your meeting this week?
There wasn't any widespread support at all for a 50 basis point cut today. You know, I think we've done very large rate hikes and very large rate cuts in the last 5 years, and you tend to do those at a time when you feel that policy is out of place and needs to move quickly to a new place. That's not at all what I consider. I feel like our policy has been doing the right thing so far this year. I think we were right to wait and see how tariffs and inflation and the labor market evolve. I think we're now reacting to the much lower level of job creation and other evidence of softening in the labor market, and saying, well, those risks are maybe not fully balanced, but moving in the direction of balance now, and so that warrants a change in policy.
Colby Smith with the New York Times. Should we be viewing today's cut as the committee taking out some insurance against the possibility that the labor market is at risk of weakening, or is it the committee's view that the dynamics of a downturn are already in place? I guess I'm just trying to square the shift in the rate forecast in the SEP towards more cuts than just 3 months ago, with that forecast for unemployment and change.
Yeah, I think you could think of this in a way as a risk management cut, because if you look at the SEP, actually projections for growth this year next actually ticked up just a little bit, and inflation and unemployment didn't really move it. So what's different now? What's different now is that you see a very different picture of the risks to the labor market. You've seen, we were looking at 150,000 jobs a month at the time of the last meeting, and now we see the revisions and we see the new numbers. And I don't want to put too much emphasis on payroll job creation, but it's just one of the things that suggests that the labor market is really cooling off, and that tells you that it's time to take that into account in our policy.
The SEP, once again, the median participant has inflation higher than previously expected by the end of next year, and the Fed not getting back to the 2% target until 2028. So I guess I'm just wondering how you characterize the risk to price pressures of kicking off a series of cuts next month.
Yeah, so I would look at it this way. We fully understand and appreciate that we need to remain fully committed to restoring 2% inflation on a sustained basis, and we will do that.
Một lần nữa thì cái mục tiêu lạm phát 2% của Fed lại được nghi vấn.
Really since April, to me,
Liệu có đạt được không? Ở đây thì trong cái dự báo về lạm phát của Fed đến tận năm 2028 thì lạm phát nó chỉ là mức 2, anh chỉ để em chút để em xem lại. Đến tận năm 2028 thì đạt mốc mục tiêu là 2%, nghĩa là mất 3 năm nữa. Thì họ đang đặt ra một cái nghi vấn là liệu có đạt được thật không? Fed thì đang khá tự tin vào kinh tế của Mỹ, anh chị nhé. Cái tăng trưởng GDP thực hồi tháng 6 kỳ vọng đến cuối năm nay 1,4%, nhưng mà đến bây giờ thì lại kỳ vọng lên tận 1,6% rồi. Và của năm 2026 thì chỉ kỳ vọng 1,6% trong tháng 6, thì đến tháng 9 kỳ vọng tăng lên 1,8% rồi. Có mỗi cái dự báo về lạm phát, có mỗi cái dự báo về việc hạ lãi suất và giảm thôi. Như vậy là chúng ta thấy là Fed đang có cái giọng điệu khá là tự tin trong việc là có thể giải quyết bài toán về suy thoái kinh tế, về thị trường lao động bằng cách hạ lãi suất và vẫn đảm bảo được tăng trưởng kinh tế, và lạm phát nó vẫn về được mức mục tiêu.
2% does not seem to be in sight.
Vâng,
Suggests the
chúng ta
2%
phải bán nhé, chúng ta không nên mua đoạn này bởi vì là giá vàng đã tăng trước tin rất là nhiều rồi. Cho nên lúc tin ra thì nó phải có cái áp lực chốt lời của thị trường.
Well, I mean, you're right. It does say we're going to get to 2% inflation in 2028, but that's, that's literally how you put the projections together. You're writing down a rate path, which is designed to create over the course of the SEP, time frame, 2% inflation and maximum employment too. So that's all that is. No one really knows where the economy will be in 3 years, but the nature of the exercise is to write down policy that you believe will return to the 2% goal or at least by the end of the exercise.
Thanks so much, Elizabeth Schulze with ABC News. The latest inflation report shows that prices are still going up across key categories for many households, including groceries. What will the Fed do if prices pick up more?
So our expectation, and you can see this consistently through the year, has been that inflation will move up this year, but that basically because of the effects on goods prices from tariffs, but that those will turn out to be a one-time price increase as opposed to creating an inflationary process. That's been our forecast. Pretty much all the individual forecasts say that. We can't just assume that, though, right? We have to. Our job is literally to make sure that is what happens, and we will do that job. Right now, the situation we're in is that we see inflation. We continue to expect it to move up, maybe not as high as we would have expected it to move up a few months ago. The pass-through of the tariffs into inflation has been slower and smaller. The labor market has softened, so the case for there being a persistent inflation outbreak is less. And so that's why we think it's time for us really to acknowledge that the risks to the other mandate have grown and that we should move in the direction of neutral. So what will we do? We'll do what we need to do, but we have two mandates and we try to balance them. For a long time, our framework says
Thì cái Fed đã đang hỏi về cái độ khó khăn của cái việc duy trì cả hai mục tiêu về đà lạm phát lẫn mục tiêu về thị trường lao động.
What we do is we ask which is how far is each from the goal and how long is it expected to get to the goal. So, and then we think about those things and we see, as I mentioned, our policy has been really skewed toward inflation for a long time. Now we see that there's downside risk clearly in the labor market, and so we're moving in the direction.
Cho nên thì những cái chính sách của chúng tôi thì là thiên về việc là điều chỉnh cũng như là khống chế lạm phát hơn. Và gần đây thì chúng tôi có việc chỉnh chính sách để có thể hướng đến thị trường lao động nhiều hơn.
We think it's appropriate that we reduce our rates so that we become more neutral, which presumably will be better for the labor market. You see people who are sort of more at the margins, so kids coming out of college and younger people, minorities are having a hard time finding jobs. The overall job finding rate is very, very low. However, the layoff rate is also very low. So you've got a low hiring environment. And the concern is that if you start to see layoffs, the people who are laid off there won't be a lot of hiring volume. So that could very quickly flow into higher unemployment. In a healthier economy, healthier labor market, there will be jobs for those people. But now the hiring rate is very, very low. So that's been a growing concern over the last few months. And it's one of the reasons why we think it's appropriate that we begin to shift our policy focus toward a more balanced one.
Tiếp ông vào đang 37. Các bác chú ý cho rồi xem này đúng rồi, nó lời chị ạ.
And I wonder if you pointedly did not use it this time. And in fact, when you said policy is not a preset versus, do you mean that is sort of the opposite of recalibration? Are we meeting to meeting, data point by data point? Are we in the process of getting that? Thank you.
So I think we're in a meeting by meeting situation. We're going to be looking at the data. Let me say a word about the SEP really here. So we often point this out. But the SEP it's an accumulation of the individual projections of 19 people. showing what they believe at a particular moment in time to be the most likely path for the economy and thus the appropriate path for monetary policy as well. And as you know, we don't debate or try to agree on what that is. We just break them down and accumulate them. We do sometimes discuss them. And so we always say we're not on a preset path, and we really mean that. The actual decisions we make are going to be based on the incoming data, the evolving outlook, and the balance of risks at the time the decisions are actually made. So you will have seen that we have 10 participants out of 19 who wrote down 2 or more cuts for the remainder of the year, and 9 who wrote down fewer than, in fact, in a good number of cases, no more cuts. So rather than looking at this as certainty, I would encourage people, as always, to look at the SEP as through the lens of probability. And so there are different possible outcomes and likelihoods rather than this one is certain and this one is uncertain. So that's important.
Getting to my follow-up question, is the dispersion in the outlook a sign of uncertainty in policy in the
You know, it's such an unusual situation. Ordinarily, when the labor market is weak, inflation is low. And when the labor market is really strong, that's when you are to be careful about inflation. So we have a situation where we have 2 sides of risk, and that means there's no risk-free path. And so it's quite a difficult situation for policymakers. And it's not at all surprising to me that you have a range of views. It's not so much about having different views for the path of the economy, but it's partly that, but it's also partly about what's the right thing to do in light of the tension between the 2 poles. How do you rate them? How worried are you about one versus the other? So it's natural. I think it would actually be surprising if you didn't have a pretty wide range of views based, in this kind of highly unusual situation, and we do. So, but we get together, we discuss. We have a great discussion, and then we decide what to do and react. But you're right, it's a wide dispersion of views, and I think that's understandable and natural in the current situation.
Hi, Victoria Guida with Politico. You've talked a lot about Fed independence and the importance of it over the years, but as markets have questions about what exactly President Trump's intentions are with the Fed, what would you point to as the things they should be watching to determine that the Fed is still making decisions based on, the economic outlook rather than political considerations?
Look, it's deeply in our culture to do our work based on the income data and never consider anything else. That's just everybody who's at the Fed really feels strongly about that way. So, you'll know it by the way we talk about what we're doing, by the speeches that people give, by the decisions that we make. You'll know that we're just still going to do that. That's all we're doing. And we don't frame these questions at all or see them in terms of political outcomes. I think when you get to another part of Washington, everything is seen through the lens of does it help or hurt this political party, this politician. That's the framework. And I think people find it hard to believe that is not at all.
Ultra nó giảm rất là mạnh với chị. Hiện tại là đã về đến khu vực 36
Serve the American people as best we can.
6
So I
7
think you
8.
would be able to tell. I don't believe we'll
Em
ever
đã nói là cái giai đoạn này áp suất là rất
say
là
we're doing our work.
em nghĩ là cái
They're making
cái
their
yếu tố bất ngờ liên quan đến cái báo báo nó sẽ không còn nhiều nữa đâu. Các câu hỏi quan trọng thì đã được hỏi đầu tiên rồi. Em không thấy có gì mới và nổi bật cả. Ngoài việc là kỳ vọng Fed sẽ hạ lãi suất nhiều hơn trong năm nay, cho thấy là Fed sẽ tự tin hơn trong việc viết bài toán về thị trường lao động. Trong bối cảnh là lạm phát mà vẫn đang là yếu tố gây giảm thì Fed vẫn khá tự tin là lạm phát sẽ về lại mục tiêu. Vì vậy là chúng ta đang thấy được là Fed đang tự tin sẽ đưa Mỹ ra khỏi cái tình thế một quốc gia đình lại, thoát khỏi suy thoái kinh tế và thoát khỏi cả lạm phát nữa. Thì cái điều này là một cái điều mà nếu mà với sự tự tin đấy nó lấn sang mọi thị trường thì nó sẽ khiến cho thị trường chốt lời vàng rất là mạnh. Nên anh chị cẩn thận, nếu anh chị cầm vàng nhẫn thì có thể là chốt, có thể là chốt, bởi vì là sau ngày hôm nay thì thị trường ngày mai khi mà phiên án nổ ra thì áp lực chốt lời vàng sẽ dễ tiếp tục diễn ra. Còn em nghĩ là em sẽ xuống cái buổi live này ở đây và cập nhật với anh chị quý khách hàng ở trong nhóm chăm sóc của các anh chị khách hàng, cũng như là cập nhật lên những cái trang thông tin của Golden Fund và website goldenfund.vn và vàng 247. Anh chị vui lòng phải theo dõi về những cái tin tức liên quan đến Fed và liên quan câu hỏi FOMC tối nay. Xin cảm ơn anh chị rất là nhiều, và anh chị lưu ý là với vàng hiện tại thì chúng ta nên canh bán hơn là canh mua anh chị nhé. Cảm ơn anh chị rất là nhiều.
That's happened all over really. Response rates are just lower to